Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode explores the questions that archaeology can address about ancient cultures. This presentation updates my prior video about the same topic, although the content here is consistent with my original video. By the end of this episode, you will be familiar with the abilities and the limitations of the physical archaeological record to reveal aspects about ancient cultural groups and contexts. You can consider the roles of the objective archaeological evidence toward testing hypotheses about how and why ancient cultures functioned as they did, varied cross-culturally, and changed through time. This presentation follows the premise that the archaeological record offers partial remnants of ancient societies. Some aspects of those societies are represented better than others, and we always engage in some degree of interpreting those partial representations. In an excavation, you might find pottery fragments that reveal the original shapes of vessels, or you might find shellfish remains that suggest something about ancient diets. What are the further steps, though, toward interpreting how a past society had functioned? Any interpretation about an ancient culture starts with the concepts of how cultures operate in general. In one point of view, human cultures are made of different aspects, elements, or building blocks that can be configured in diverse ways. Many different schematics could be proposed, but here I will offer one basic general purpose framework. When trying to describe any cultural group, you can refer to its technology, economy, social organization, politics, ideology, aesthetics, and communication. I will define these terms and give examples in archaeology, but first, I want to stress that all people and all groups of people possess the same capacity and number of functional components like those mentioned here. The individual expressions and configurations can be highly variable from one group to another, as well as through changing conditions over time. You can imagine how population growth will increase the overall diversity of a group of people, and accordingly, the group will experience more variety in its inventory of traits in technology, economy, and other elements. In this scenario, a group needs to develop ways of accommodating its increasing diversity. Every group has a different threshold or tolerance limit of what it can manage. Often, diversity simply is incorporated into the larger population. Sometimes, though, separate groups or subgroups can develop. Archaeologists potentially can identify these groups or subgroups according to their material expressions or reflections in the archaeological record. We might refer to a group according to one of its functional components or a number of those components in combination. Of course, the individual people of the past may have defined their own identities quite differently from what we can ascertain in their surviving archaeological assemblages. Nonetheless, we can observe the material record and describe its contents in terms of the represented functional components of a past culture. As you know, archaeological evidence does not reveal cultural functions in action, so we always need to interpret or infer those functions. Technology is close with the material evidence, and therefore we can interpret technological functions fairly easily. We next can recognize an increasing role of inference for studying the other cultural functions of economy, social organization, and continuing from there. When we talk about different levels of interpretation or inference in archaeology, then often we refer to the concept of a ladder of inference, as popularized by Christopher Hawkes in 1954. Hawks outlined how archaeologists can make their strongest and most confident inferences about physical site formation processes. The next level of comfort might be for interpreting subsistence economy, given the overall informative material records of food middens, cooking utensils, and related findings. Archaeologists then would face more difficulty for interpreting social and political functions, and they would be at their weakest when trying to interpret religious or spiritual contexts. In this presentation, I do not follow exactly the functional categories as proposed by Hawks in 1954, but I use the same concept of the relative roles of observation and interpretation. Here I will outline one approach that has been effective in my research, while I encourage you to develop your own schematic. Technology arguably is the most accurately represented cultural function in its archaeological signature. We can make reasonable inferences about technology simply through our observations of the raw materials and the physical properties involved in the artifacts, house ruins, and other evidence in the archaeological record. If you are looking for a general definition of technology that you can apply for any cultural group around the world and in any time period, then you might consider the practical function of technology in its most general sense. In this way, I think of technology as a way of modifying the natural environment around us through the creation or manipulation of physical properties. We all have different skill levels, but we share the capacity to create and use technology. One classic example of technological change in the archaeological record has been the chronology of Stone, Bronze, and Iron Ages. I have mentioned this example in other videos, but several cases have shown how technologies change through time in the forms, functions, and styles of stone tools, pottery traditions, and many other artifacts. We can improve our interpretations by observing how people use technology in larger cultural contexts. For example, what tools and operations are involved in constructing a house? How is the larger technological repertoire represented in an archaeological site, perhaps in an arrangement of post molds? When we find fragments of tools, then we need to remember that originally they were parts of larger objects and contexts. We might find pieces of cut and polished shells that had been broken from adzes or other woodworking tools. The technology of shaping and polishing a piece of shell needs to be recognized as different from the technology of using an adze or other tool during a tree cutting or woodworking project. After technology, economy is the next most straightforward aspect of an ancient culture that can be studied in the archaeological record. In the simplest terms, you can describe economy as involving the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Any single archaeological site tends to show just one portion of a larger economy, and most often we see the end results after episodes of using or consuming materials. We can, though, identify different parts of an economic system in workshop sites, in agricultural fields, and in other contexts. Innumerable archaeological studies have focused on subsistence economy, given the fact that food remains can be well preserved in site middens. A typical study begins with identifying the food items, preferably with taxonomic identifications of animal bones, shells, or preserved plant remains. Each category can be quantified in counts or weights. Many studies end at this step, providing simple lists of the food items and their relative abundance. Further analysis, though, would tend to involve a series of approximations and assumptions, such as when estimating the edible food weight, converting this information into calories, or evaluating the usable nutrition in carbohydrates or protein. In addition to the records of subsistence economy, archaeological sites can offer information about crafting economy, such as in stone tools or pottery traditions. Some crafting economies were practiced broadly by many people or households meeting their own needs, while others may have been specialized in the hands of a few individuals. Specialized toolkits can suggest the degree of recognizing particular tasks in an economy. For example, grinding basins can be made in all shapes and sizes, each designed for specific tasks within their generic category as grinding basins. Similarly, many sling stones are unique in their color and texture, yet they tend to be made with a limited set of parameters of their material density and physical dimensions. Workshop sites can provide some of the most useful information about crafting economies. Stone tool workshops, for example, can reveal the preferences for specific raw materials, the details of the production process, and possibly the organization of labor. Archaeologists need to look at multiple sites of the same age in order to comprehend the whole economic system of production, distribution, and consumption. Some sites can be identified as the sources of raw materials, and they could include primary workshops as well. From those workshops, the products need to be transported or distributed to their consumers. Sometimes multiple steps or intermediaries are involved. When we see these interrelated parts of an economic system, then we can study the operation more accurately and completely. We can learn how the individual labor tasks were organized, and this organization can link with other aspects of a society. In this schematic view of an economy, you can see how someone potentially could assert control, such as at the sources of raw materials or along the distribution networks. Politics may become involved in developing policies or regulations about how to manage these situations. Ideology or belief systems can guide the political decisions that affect an economy, such as in preferences for capitalism, free market enterprise, or communal wealth. Without discussing all of the details, you should be able to appreciate the interconnections among different elements of a cultural system. By starting with what we can observe most directly in technology and economy, we can build stronger inferences about social organization, politics, and other aspects of past cultures. Social organization is not directly observable in the archaeological record, but aspects of it can be reflected in habitation sites, village settlement layouts, and other material expressions. You can think of social organization as involving the ordering of how individual people relate with each other in a group. Social roles for people often are structured according to age and gender, but many other factors can influence how a group can fill all of the necessary roles and tasks for maintaining a society. In practical terms that can relate with archaeological evidence, we might consider how social roles and tasks are organized. First, though, we would need to know something about the potential categories of roles and tasks within a group. What are they? And are these roles assigned, achieved, fixed, or variable? Potentially, we can associate certain forms of artifacts, housing design, or village layouts with social groups or identities. Some personal ornaments, such as pendants, can be highly individualistic or unique, and they can signify an individual person's identity, separate from membership in a group. Other items, such as shell beads, can be found in large numbers and across many different sites and contexts. These qualities suggest that several people shared in the same tradition of using these beads, and we can think of such a tradition as a sign of group membership. In another example, we might detect slight variations in the appearance of pottery bowls. Here you can see mildly different forms of exterior marking on earthenware bowls that otherwise would look remarkably similar to each other. Each of these categories could signify a different group, although we would need another independent line of evidence to ascertain what those groups were. When examining housing formats and village layouts, we can learn about how each architectural design compared with a standard model, while also allowing for individual expression. We can study how the various activity areas were organized overall and how they were used differently from each other. We can develop ideas of how the spatial layouts might reflect the arrangements of social roles and tasks within a household or within a community at different scales. Politics and ideology are closely linked. For the purposes of this video, I am defining politics as serving a function of making decisions that affect the livelihood of a group of people. Political decisions, in many cases, are focused on how to manage internal law and order, but equally, they could regulate external relations. You can think of modern political entities with domestic or internal affairs, along with foreign or external affairs. Like all of the functional elements of culture, politics can operate at different scales or numbers of people. In smaller groups, political functioning can be subtle. In larger groups with more diversity of people and opinions, politics can become increasingly complicated and structured. In archaeology, aspects of politics tend to be studied in the cases of large populations with complicated or complex rules and regulations. One example is at the Angkor complex in Cambodia. Angkor Wat traditionally has been regarded as a center of power and authority. The architectural complex was built in several episodes, approximately from AD 900 through 1500. And today, it incorporates a number of different elements reflecting a long political history. The political apparatus at Angkor Wat was connected closely with religious ideology. Religious beliefs and philosophies, in a sense, justified the creation of the monuments and the authority of the political leaders. Ideology filled a similar role in other complex political entities, although it might be more subtle than seen here in Angkor. Ideology rarely is detectable directly in archaeological evidence, but we can notice its reflections or its connections with other aspects of culture. Even in the exemplary case of Angkor Wat, we know about the religious ideology primarily from temple inscriptions, artworks, and written records of what happened to be consistent with the material site remains. In order to study the indirect representations of ideology, we can start with defining ideology as a group's belief system or explanatory view of why the world exists in the way that it does, and how people should behave in this view of the world. Ideology tends to be implicit and easily misunderstood, especially by outside observers. Many archaeologists avoid studying ideology except in the most general terms. Ideology can be quite variable within a society, from one individual to another, or even within a single person's lifetime. Knowing these qualities, perhaps we should be cautious about regarding any group as engaged in any particularly fixed ideological position. In fact, the more that some members of a group try to institute a single ideological order, the more we should be suspicious that other members of the group probably hold different opinions. In terms of archaeological research, ideology most often is viewed as a way of justifying decisions in politics, social organization, and economy that tend to be easier to examine in their material aspects. Continuing with the example of the Angkor complex in Cambodia, several temples obviously served religious functions, categorically different from royal palaces. One of the main tourist attractions today is the Bayon Temple. Although its primary function was religious, the monumental construction effectively materialized the power and authority of the temple into the landscape and into history, similar to what we might expect of a political statement through monumental construction. Most of the Angkorian temples include water pools or reservoirs, especially important in a region with a pronounced wet season versus dry season each year. Water is regarded as sacred in many societies worldwide, but these qualities were highly formalized at the Angkorian temples. In this case, we can appreciate how religious beliefs were applied to control an essential natural resource and thereby permeate the functioning of the society at large. Next, I would like to mention how archaeologists can study aesthetic systems. You can think of the aesthetic experience as embodying the notions or senses of beauty, and accordingly, aesthetics are highly subjective. In archaeological materials, we can see only a few preserved portions of aesthetic systems. We tend to see only some parts of the visual arts, and we find little or no representation of other art forms or sensory expressions. Moreover, we can see only the surviving remnants of aesthetic-related products, and we are missing the information about the acts of performance and experience that tend to be the most meaningful aspects of aesthetics in real life. Here you can see an example of the aesthetics involved in clothing, specifically in bark cloth. Bark cloth does not survive in most archaeological sites, but it has been an important tradition in Taiwan and in many communities all across the Asia-Pacific region. The process of manufacturing and the acts of wearing bark cloth were regular parts of aesthetics of daily life for thousands of years, yet the only material trace archaeologically might be the occasional bark cloth beater tool. Mostly in archaeology, aesthetics are represented partially in some visual artworks. Although the opportunities can be limited in many cases, we nonetheless can discuss our observations in terms of the design principles, motifs, and technical execution. Design principles refer to the preferences or guidelines for using certain shapes, colors, textures, or themes, such as symmetry or balance. Motifs could be any symbols or shapes that occur repeatedly. These pottery fragments show motifs of rows of circles, sets of line incisions, and zone filling by point impressions. Some motifs are used in combinations with others, and the results potentially could be complex. Technical execution is perhaps easier for archaeologists to study, looking at the toolkits for making the designs of circles, line incisions, and point impressions. Of special interest here, you can see that different kinds of pointed tip tools were used for making these dentate stamped designs. In some views, aesthetics could be studied as part of a group's communication system, but here I will treat communication as its own functional category. I define communication as a way of facilitating the sharing and learning of information among the members of a group. Language is the primary mode of communication for most groups, and often it signals the group's identity. In archaeological contexts, we cannot witness the language in action, and only in certain historical sites can we find written records that relate directly with communications. In most archaeological sites, communication is represented in artistic expressions, such as you saw in the examples of aesthetics and design systems in pottery decorations. Additional clues about communications could be obtained through studying roads or pathways, trade routes, ports, and marketplaces. Now that you have reviewed the range of functions in a cultural system, you might be curious about how archaeologists study chronological change in each of those functions, or in the cultural system as a whole. In the simplest terms, in any group of people, the necessary cultural functions can be fulfilled in variable ways. People make choices in how they will meet their needs in technology, economy, and other functional categories. Whenever new circumstances might alter the demand for a certain function, then an opportunity arises to select in favor of one option and by default against the other options. You can see this kind of chronological trend whenever people prefer to use a new technology, such as stone tools becoming less popular while bronze or iron might become more popular. In the modern world, we can point to the examples of abandoning older computers, televisions, and telephones in favor of whatever may be the newest models. The archaeological record offers numerous examples of chronological change in artifacts, food middens, house ruins, and other materials. We could interpret those records in terms of changing aspects of technology, economy, or other functions as we have reviewed in this presentation. Whenever we see a chronological change in the archaeological record, then we can look for the cause of that particular change. What happened that altered the demands on the cultural system for using certain forms of technology, for maintaining the economy, or for satisfying other cultural functions? Among the potential root causes for cultural change, we might consider environmental factors, population growth, and many other possibilities. To some extent, our explanations will depend on the available evidence. In situations where we can see abundant pottery changing through time, then we can develop our research questions and methodologies around our ability to collect datasets about the traits of pottery. In other situations, perhaps food middens, housing formats, or different forms of evidence are available, and we would need to adjust our research programs accordingly. If you are aware of how the material artifacts and other datasets relate with past cultural functions, then you can formulate testable hypotheses, logically linking the datasets with the testable theoretical explanations. As I have outlined here, archaeology works most directly and convincingly with aspects of technology or economy that are close with the observable material data. You could explore other aspects of past cultures, but the role of inference or interpretation can strain or perhaps outweigh the limits of the material archaeological evidence. In concluding this episode, now you should be familiar with a framework for posing questions about ancient cultures in archaeology. You can evaluate the abilities and the limitations of the objective archaeological record for exploring and testing different hypotheses about ancient cultures. Did you like this video? Please remember to subscribe to this channel and see new content every month with the Archaeology Studio.